Okay, the time is now 1:10, so we're going to get started. The speakers are going to be Greg Rucker, John Hart, and James Taylor. Not the James Taylor, another one. No guitar in hand. Please mute your phones, your cell phones, and if you have any questions during the question and answer period, please come up and use the microphone. And we can now start. Gentlemen?
The rain in Spain falls mainly on the plain. Okay, there we go. How you doing? My name is Craig Rucker, and I welcome you to this panel. It's actually hosted by my good friend here, James Taylor, not to be confused with the singer, though he can karaoke. Yeah, he's a mean karaoke guy. The other thing about James, by the way, first off, the guy's amazing. He runs the Heartland Institute, which is a prominent think tank in Chicago, nationally. He's been on TV. You've probably seen him beyond his singing career. And the other nice thing about James, and I don't know if there's a little known fact about him, he's an amazing poker player. He was actually on ESPN, finished top 20 in the World Series of Poker. So him and I actually are going to be driving after this to go to Salt Lake and down to Tucson. If we stop and play cards, I may have only my shirt left on my back by the time I get home to Washington. Anyway, I represent a group called CFAC, the Committee for a Constructive Tomorrow out of Washington, D.C. Thank you. I am the president, one of the co-founders, which goes back to 1985. Just a few brief things, shameless promotion here. We work on environmental and energy issues and have been doing so since back in the Reagan era. And in fact, I kind of cut my teeth in the Reagan era, being a big fan of his. I actually shook his hand back before he was even president, as I was a supporter of his, and the answer is no, I haven't washed his hands since. So he's been a big influence in my thinking. We have a number of different programs that are probably worth mentioning. We work on environmental issues. We have a collegians program where we do outreach to young people and have campus chapters. We also have a board of scientists and academic advisors, and if you go to our website, cfac.org, you'll see just a discussion of anything that deals with the environment from a conservative or free market perspective. In addition, we have perhaps one of the most trafficked websites for climate skepticism, which is called climatedepot.com. And Rush Limbaugh called it his favorite source of climate information other than himself. So we're kind of proud of that. And we also do a lot of work in the developing world, go to UN conferences and the like. So that's my shameless self-promotion. If you want to find out more, go to cfac.org and get updates today. So our discussion today is really going to focus on a number of different groups that are out there. And there's been a kind of division within the libertarian/conservative ranks over this issue of climate. And on one hand, you have those who kind of agree with the UN consensus on the science, and those of us who are more skeptical about the world ending in 12 years, I guess you could say, as AOC would say. And we represent, James and I do, the group that would be more skeptical on what the claims are that are coming out of our EPA, government, and the like. And we've invited John over here from Senator Coburn's office to give us the other point of view. I just want to say, as a Baptist pastor friend of mine once said, he said, whenever you give a talk, Craig, do three things. Number one, start with some sort of interesting or provocative beginning. I've already failed at that. Number two, end with a spellbinding conclusion. And number three, keep number one and two as close together as possible. So I will endeavor to do that. And I would like to lay out for you, first off, the idea that this is even a division in our side is only working to the benefit of those on the left, and we think that's unfortunate. But I would argue that our position, the one that James and I have, is the better position to take, which is more adversarial toward what the climate science is saying and what we're being fed by the UN. And I will offer 4 reasons for that. As to why I think libertarians/conservatives should not buy into the hype. We should challenge it. And before we work on any solutions, which I don't think are necessarily necessary, we should at least address this, because the well-misinformed public, if they buy into this hype, will have a propensity to want to go toward the more extremist solutions. So my number one reason why I think that we ought to take a different tack than some of the more liberal libertarian groups do, on, well, more moderate no liberal, but moderate libertarian groups do on this issue, is I think facts are on our side. And the facts should count for something if you're a libertarian. The truth of the matter is, on issue after issue in the climate change debate, whether it's sea level rise, polar bears, melting ice caps, droughts, what did I say, lions and tigers and bears, we could do what, wildfires, flooding, and polar bears, oh my. We think that the facts line up on our side. We had a debate earlier today where some of those facts were discussed, but just a quick survey, if you're looking at sea level rise, we believe at our website, his is Climate Realism, mine's Climate Depot, you can see what the real facts are. It's rising about what, 1 to 4 centimeters a year. It's been doing that for centuries, long before this debate. There is no apocalypse. You got issues like polar bears. They were at 3,000 back in the 60s. They're up to what now, 25, 30,000 today. If anything, global warming's helped them increase and procreate. You find this with droughts becoming less severe. This is IPCC language I could quote for you. I have them, but I won't bore you with them. You could find this with wildfires, were more catastrophic before climate change was an issue in the early part of the centuries. There's been an uptick because we aren't clearing the forest, but in general, they're not a serious thing. But on issue after issue, I think that the facts need to get out to the people, and the people are well misinformed, and the left is using that misinformation to push their agenda. 3 books I'd like to recommend to you. These are people that were on the other side, but I think have come to see the light, saying what James and I and our organizations have been saying for a decade. One is by Michael Schellenberger called Apocalypse Never. This was a guy that was tapped by Obama to kind of put in the Green New Deal back in the 2009 era. Another one is False Alarm by Bjorn Lomborg, who actually was kind of on the other side, but also came to see the light a while back. And the last one's by Steve Koonin, who's made a lot of news in recent years because he was also a chief science advisor to Obama, but now has come around to seeing that the science is, there is no alarm. There's no reason to be taking drastic action on this particular issue. You can also, again, go see the Climate Realism website and ours, climatedepot.com. So facts count, and libertarians should not abandon them. Number 2 is the idea that even if we followed the prescriptions that are being put out there by groups like the American Conservation Coalition and R Street, it wouldn't matter. And why do I say that? Because emissions from developing countries are eclipsing anything that we're doing. China right now has what, 30% of greenhouse emissions. They're building 1 new coal plant almost every week. And we could do nuclear power, we could plant trees, we could do carbon. It's all going to be dwarfed because even the Paris Accords do not bind them into this. They have vague commitments of some future reductions. And for that purpose, it isn't. And if that isn't enough, I like this one little quote. This is actually said by our current president when he agreed to get back in the Paris Accord. He said, quote, "The United States accounts for less than 15% of carbon emissions. The rest of the world, 85%. Now figure this logic. That's why I keep my commitment to rejoin the Paris Accord." So, because if we do everything perfectly, it's not going to matter. Follow that logic? I joined the Paris Accord because even if we do everything perfectly, it's not going to matter. That's what, well, you may think that's a mental error, but actually it was echoed by John Kerry back in 2015, right before the Paris. He said, "The fact is that if every American citizen biked to work, carpooled to school, used only solar-powered panels to power their home, if we each planted a dozen trees, if we somehow eliminated all our domestic greenhouse gas emissions, guess what? It wouldn't be enough to offset the carbon pollution coming from the rest of the world. It isn't going to matter." So why are we jumping on board and trying to show our concern about an issue that A, isn't a threat, and B, is one that even if we do these expensive measures, isn't going to solve the problem. Number 3, the proposed solutions cause more harm than good. Heritage Foundation did a study, said if by rejoining the Paris Climate Pact, there will be some 400,000 jobs lost in America, the average total income loss of more than $20,000 per family, and an aggregate GDP loss of over $2.5 trillion. We have seen in areas that have gone the route of the Green New Deal and what the left has prescribed. I know that ACC and John are not in favor of this, but I fear that a lot of what they're proposing will give energy to this. We see that there's been energy poverty on the rise, blackouts and disruptions in places like California, Australia, Germany, and most recently in Texas. Jobs are shifted overseas because China's not, doing anything about their manufacturing. They're continuing to put out them while our factories get shuttered. And you'll see the environment suffer because we're going to need materials for the Green New Deal. Where do we get them from? China, which has no problem pumping toxic waste into its rivers and streams. And of course, you have wind power, which kills somewhere, according to the American Bird Society, between 500,000 and 1.4 million birds and bats every year. So it's not even environment, leave alone the habitat that's needed to be churned up to put this into place. So the last thing I want to say is that I think the other big reason that I would disagree with these efforts to try to bring our two sides together is because of the fact that I think it's giving onus to the whole Green New Deal argument. After all, if we're in an emergency, we got to do something. If we seed things like carbon storage, carbon taxes, some of these measures they're talking about, those are the beginning points for where we will start to seed. We're kind of seeding, as I say, Czechoslovakia and Poland, they're not going to be satisfied. Those become the beginning and the bargaining points to move on to more onerous regulations that the Greens will certainly put forward. And to not see that before we send and give them a platform by agreeing to these lesser measures, I think we're buying ourselves a lot of future problems. So I probably went on too long, but anyway, that is my position and the position of our organization at CFACT.
Well, thanks so much for the invitation. I don't know if you guys saw the debate we just had with Mark and Benji and James, but it got a little more heated than I would have liked. So I hope, James, you can forgive me for referencing some things that you couldn't respond to. So I think it's really important that we figure out where we agree, because the reality is, as Craig said at the beginning, that if we're fighting, the left is winning, okay? So the area of agreement we have is 98, 99%. So, as Reagan might say, but the 98% person who's with you is my friend, not my enemy. So that's the spirit with which I want to approach this. So our organization is called the Conservative Coalition for Climate Solutions. I know can you hear me? Check. Yeah, that's better. I'll just speak more clearly into it. So our organization is called the Conservative Coalition for Climate Solutions. We know full well that that's a bit of a record scratch when you put the words conservative and climate together. But we're doing that because what we want to do is make the case that whether you, and look, I'm kind of agnostic on the science. We can talk about the science, happy to debate it. I do think there's some risk, but I strongly disagree with the climate alarmism camp, who they're claiming that the world's going to end in 10 years. Quote, the science is not saying that. They are using the issue to fight a proxy war against capitalism. So I'm interested in saving capitalism, and I do think if we save capitalism, the planet's going to be cleaner, we're going to be better off in the process. So we did a study called Free Economies or Clean Economies, published by Nick Loris, who we hired from the Heritage Foundation. The conclusion there is that freer societies are twice as clean as less free. So why would we not lean into that message and make that very, very passionately and clear? And let me ask you to think about the issue of poverty. So all of the logic that you just heard is if we acknowledge that the other side is a point, if we sort of give an inch, they'll take a mile. I understand all that. I do think there's reason to be concerned. And often when politicians want to be, quote, for something, they choose the big government light approach. Totally get that, totally see it. But that's not always the case. But to make it not the case, it takes a lot of effort. But an area where we succeeded as libertarians, conservatives, is the issue of poverty. So you can agree that poverty is undesirable. That doesn't make you a socialist. It's kind of it's a bit of a non sequitur. And I think the same is true with the issue of climate. You can say if you think the climate is a threat because of man-made global warming, that does not necessarily follow that you're going to embrace or enable or facilitate socialist solutions. So our organization wants to go really, really far to the right. In other words, what I would like to do is my perfect, answer. Look at issues like the Unshackle Act that Mike Lee's put out. he would reform the 50-year-old National Environmental Policy Act that causes new clean technologies to be delayed by sometimes 5 or 7 years. Totally insane set of regulations. So deregulation is a priority. I believe we need to recycle government waste, not create more. If you remember the Bridge to Nowhere, I'm the guy that helped make that famous. I worked for Tom Coburn, led the fight on earmarks. I loathe government waste. So I want to recycle government waste and give most of it back to you, most of it back to the free market, because I believe that the best solution is economic freedom and innovation. Now, would we be okay with some spending that was offset to, hey, let's help speed up the deployment of nuclear energy? I'm not anti-renewables. Renewables can be part of the answer, but there's not enough land, for example, to really solve this, quote unquote, through solar. It's just not going to happen. Yeah, so what I believe is that we need an all of the above energy strategy. That means fracking. You know, nothing is responsible for more CO2 reductions the past 20 years than fracking. So if the left wants to, quote, follow the science, well, they need to be praising fracking. Clearly they're not, because they're waging a pseudo-religious war against fossil fuels. So anyway, those are some of the positions, but we're happy to get into any other elements that you want to.
All right, thank you, John. Craig, I'm going to scoot a little bit closer to you because the mic is not reaching. I like you, but don't take that the wrong way.
That's okay. We're a very diverse, tolerant group.
All right. So, and by the way, if I pull back from the mic or if you're not hearing me well, do this or something. I don't want you to miss out. And if I'm going to be speaking, my goodness, it shouldn't be wasted. Anyway, thank you for being here today. I'm James Taylor, president of the Heartland Institute, and we have been fighting the battle for scientific truth ever since I joined Heartland in 2001, and I know we were doing that beforehand. And I imagine many of you were at the climate change debate. Are we facing a climate crisis? And thank you for those who were. And it's important that we had that debate. It's important that we look at those issues, because here's the deal. If there is no problem, then why are we proposing a, quote, solution? A solution requires a problem. And certainly if there are policy prescriptions that folks advocate that reduce the size of government and that give us more freedom, then really it doesn't matter if there is a global warming crisis or not. But we'll get to that in a minute. But the first thing to point out, I think, is that in that climate change debate, I did present a good deal of science. I told you who it came from. They were from the data that I showed were from that I spoke about. We're from the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, from the United Nations Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, et cetera. And there was no counter evidence presented. The title was, are we facing a climate crisis? And so I guess that the other side conceded on that, but I don't blame them.
I'm happy to talk about it now. We didn't have time.
Well, we had time. That was the whole debate. But anyway, but the point is this. If we are going to advocate self-described conservative solutions to the climate crisis, number one, show us that there is a climate crisis. Look under the hood and show us what's there, because the environmental left have always been advocating these same so-called solutions, whether it's to global warming, whether it's to the ozone hole or whatever else. And time again, the reason why a free market think tank like the Heartland Institute got involved in a scientific issue is because we saw and we know that the proposed solutions are always going to take away our freedoms, are always going to restrict market choices, and are always going to be extremely costly for the American people. And it's no different here. So over the years, really in the last few years in particular, there have been a series of so-called conservative solutions that are proposed. Groups that say, we are conservatives, we believe in a climate crisis, we need to address this. We also need to address this for political reasons. Again, show that there's a climate crisis first. That was not done today. We showed just the opposite. But the next argument is that, well, it's still good for other reasons. These are free market solutions. And I'm glad to hear when John and Benji, and I don't want to personalize this, so I'm sorry if that has the case. When groups make the argument, or when people make the argument, that we have these, well, we should be doing free market solutions anyway, we have these available. I have yet to hear with specificity what their solutions are. They want conservatives, they want libertarians to acknowledge and profess a climate crisis up front. And again, truth for truth's sake. We stand up for the truth because we stand up for the truth. They want us to profess that and then trust that they can win the political battle against the environmental left for what the so-called solutions are. So one of the things that I've heard recently is that nuclear power, that's a solution. Well, guess what? Skeptics, conservatives, libertarians tend to be pro-nuclear power. We're not in favor of impeding nuclear power development. So if that's your solution, then we really don't have a discussion. Why is this becoming such a cause celeb? What's even more important is when you look at carbon dioxide emissions, and this was alluded to a little bit earlier, but just with a little more specificity on the numbers. Since the turn of the century, the United States has reduced emissions by 14%. It's more than any other country in the world. The rest of the world has increased its emissions by 66%. The notion that we need to do something here in the United States different than what we're doing already makes no sense. We're reducing emissions. We're doing it through market forces. We're doing it primarily through natural gas, through technological innovations that have allowed the production and use of natural gas to be competitive with coal. That's why we're doing it. We don't need a big program. We don't need to say global warming is a crisis. We don't need government solutions to induce the economy to use natural gas. Ultimately, what happens is when you say acknowledge that there is a climate crisis and now let's find conservative solutions, I've yet to hear a single proposed solution that reduces the size of government and makes energy less costly. Propose that, and fine, we'll support it. We'll support it because in and of its own, on its own merits, that will stand as good policy, regardless of whether you believe in a climate crisis or not. But if you're pushing for a climate crisis acknowledgement first and then conservative solutions, we're just negotiating the terms of surrender. AOC recently said, and I'm not going to get this quote exactly right, but this is a paraphrase that's pretty close. When someone presented the notion that there are conservative solutions and that their solutions were too costly, we have better solutions, she said, wait a minute. The world's going to end in 10 years, and you're saying our solutions are too costly? We're not going to win that political debate. We're not. Once you acknowledge that there's a climate crisis, look, if there was a climate crisis, I'd be on board. I'd say the same thing. Nothing's more important than having a place to live. But if we don't have that climate crisis, there is no quote-unquote conservative solution that reduces the size of government and reduces energy costs. And if there is one, present it with specificity. Show precisely what it is, because I also believe in free markets. I also believe in conservative and libertarian and free market solutions. I don't think there's a problem that needs a solution, but those policies. But again, show us what they are. If your primary concern is reducing carbon dioxide emissions, if your primary concern is changing the way we produce and use energy, show me a way that it can be done with less government and that will reduce costs. And I just think for folks that are proposing these solutions, I think they just don't understand, or at least they haven't presented, so I'm waiting for them to identify with specificity. If you say, just join us, trust us, we'll win the political debate, but first concede there's a climate crisis, even when there isn't one, we're just setting ourselves up for a disaster. That's the way I see it. Anyway, thank you. And really the best part of sessions like these are Q&A from the audience, and but if we do so, try to make sure it's a question. I know we all have opinions, but if everyone's saying what they say, we don't really get the question and the interaction. And try to keep the questions to 60 seconds or less. And thank you so much.
Hi. Is this on?
Yes.
Okay. My name's Jim Sterling. I'm a professor at the Claremont Colleges in California. I really appreciate the good work that you're all doing, and I follow the data and look at what you're saying. I think I have a question about that confused me a little bit about, James, what you were saying, which when you talked about nuclear, you said libertarian right wing typically support that. And it seems like there's an incredible opportunity right now, if you follow Schellenberger and your own work, that to move forward on a bipartisan agreement to move forward with more nuclear power, and that's one of those that could be a market-driven solution. So I was confused because you said we sort of agree on that, and we wouldn't have a discussion, but not having a discussion is an example of bipartisan moving forward with an alternative source of energy that is dense and gives us a long time without CO2 emissions.
Right. Great observation and question. Thank you so much. I'll give a brief answer, and then I'll allow John as well, because I assume you have some thoughts on that as well. There isn't any pushback generally among Republicans, which would be the ones that tend to be fighting against the climate alarmism scenario regarding nuclear power. Nuclear power is still more expensive than coal power and natural gas, but the primary reason for that is government impediments, regulation, red tape, et cetera. If we were to allow the market to operate, to function, and with reasonable regulations as far as safety, although with new technologies there's very little that's necessary. So the notion that we can have that we need to acknowledge a climate crisis and go to nuclear power. No, we don't need to acknowledge a climate crisis to say let's allow nuclear power to do its thing. And so in that regard, again, if the goal, and nuclear power, of course, it's zero emissions. So if the goal is to reduce carbon dioxide emissions, that's a way to go about it. But there is no pushback from the skeptic or climate realism community to the so-called conservative solution of nuclear power. You're telling us something we're already agreeing with.
Yeah, a couple things. I think there's a bit of a straw man argument that's been put out where James is suggesting that those on the other side, my side, are asking you to agree that there's a crisis. That's not at all what I'm saying. What I'm suggesting is that we need to focus on this question of risk. Okay, there are what I would say are four key facts, and it's important to get the right facts and not just get the facts right, and also to ask the right questions and not just focus on what the right answer is. So to me, the key facts are the greenhouse effect is real, CO2 is a greenhouse gas, and we've shown that there is a correlation, there's a strong correlation between the concentration of CO2 and global warming. And then finally, it's a global problem. That CO2 greenhouse gases, they don't respect national boundaries. So we would totally agree on the folly of the Green New Deal, just focusing on the US. So I would say acknowledging that doesn't make you a socialist, doesn't enable socialism any more than it does that I think poverty is undesirable. So I think that's a really important point. So on the question of nuclear power, I think, again, this is where it highlights the hypocrisy of the left, okay? AOC and the Green New Deal, their whole shtick is they want an everything but energy policy. We want all of the above. They want everything but nuclear and fossil fuels because they are motivated by a pseudo-religious climate apocalyptic vision of the world. I'm not asking anyone to think that the world's going to end in 10 years. I don't believe that, but I do think there's a risk of global warming that can have an adverse effect, just as poverty is undesirable. So I think nuclear is an area where I think there is an opportunity to agree. My preference would be to, quote, pay for that by dramatically reducing the size and scope of government and through deregulation so that you make it cheaper to deploy that technology than it is today.
I am from Florida, so I'm worried about hurricanes. And I've been talking to family members and others that were saying that we're getting more and more hurricanes. So what I did, I went into the government data about major hurricanes, category 3 and up, going back to 1850 or something. And I did a regression analysis, and I saw that the line is flat. There are no more, but we're seeing it in the papers everywhere. So now my question has to do with what I'm seeing in the papers today is that we have all-time record temperatures in the western United States. I was looking in the papers, there was no mention about what is the next highest temperature. Was that a 1/10 of a degree lower, or was it several degrees lower? so that we are really having a much higher temperature than before.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Do you want me to take that first?
If you like.
Okay. Yeah, I think, the extreme weather question is a great question. So extreme weather doesn't, quote, prove anything. It doesn't prove or disprove anything. It's one piece of evidence. So again, it's about asking the right question. So I suspect we all agree that CO2 is a greenhouse gas and that we would concede there's some global warming. And I don't want to put words in anyone's mouth, but I don't think there's really a disagreement about that. It's all a question of risk. So if you look at extreme weather, you can't just look at one event and draw much of a conclusion. But these are all just data points, pieces of evidence, and you have to look at the entire record, not just over a year, but over decades. And that's why if you do look at where the trajectory is, over the last 10 years, we have had warming. And I think that supports the argument that there is some risk, but it's totally inappropriate for the climate apocalypse movement to look at a heat wave and say, this is proof that we need to have the Green New Deal. That's ridiculous.
I just want to commend him for actually looking up the data. I think that that's actually something. I mean, actually what you discovered is what the IPCC said. It concluded in one of its assessment reports, quote, there is low confidence in attributions of changes in tropical cyclone activity to human influence. So they themselves, the people on the other side, agree with you. And in fact, we used to have this the gentleman who was on our board, William Gray, since passed away, said he was a big researcher on the part of the other side. He said the worst, it's cyclical. He said that actually, in his opinion, the 50s were worse than they were presently. He died a couple of years ago. And as it turns out, a very interesting thing happens, though, with this data. And I throw this out there only because you got to be careful if you're mining for data and hottest temperatures ever. A lot of these have been, quote unquote, adjusted. Now, I know that sounds kind of odd to say, but it's actually admitted even by the other side. It's been long known that the 1930s, for example, is the hottest decade on record. I think the record temperature was in Death Valley in something like 1912, and most of the continents around the world had their records set before 1950. Why is that important? Because that's before man-made influence would have been a major factor at all in any of this. But what they've gone back is they've cooled the past, and there's been some people on our side who've looked at, and they'll show you, we do in our movie Climate Hustle, if you haven't seen it, you should, where we show what the graph was before they adjusted and after they adjusted. And one of the things they've done is temper a little bit what the hottest record is. You also got to look at how far back they're talking. A lot of times they don't go back to 1880, which is generally when the official temperature record's done. They may go back to 1980 instead of 1880. And yes, it may be in recent years it's hotter, but you got to see how long that is. So my recommendation is for all of you, do that. You can actually go to the AccuWeather forecast site, and they will actually show you. Oftentimes you'll say, boy, it's never been hotter than this. Just go check it up, and you'll find that, well, maybe it was a lot hotter in the past. And, on all these different issues, you'll find that the data actually refutes much of what the alarmists are saying.
Very quickly, a couple of points. First of all, I'm from Florida, too. I spent almost all my adult life there. I love Florida. I would be very upset if something were going to happen to Florida. But here's the thing. Florida just recently set its record for the longest time period in recorded history without a single hurricane strike. I believe that finally ended in 2017, give or take a year. And I used to tell people, just wait. Once a hurricane hits Florida, they're going to blame global warming and say it's another sign of the climate crisis. Just like the United States as a whole went through its longest period just recently, set a record for its longest period in history without a major hurricane, Cat 3 or higher. And I tell people the same thing. As soon as we get one, they're all going to say this is climate change, climate crisis, without mentioning we just went through the longest period without such a thing. And most of the high temperature records, high temperature records get set. They get set all the time. So do low temperature records. The majority of high temperature records, all-time high temperature records in the United States, were set during the first half of the 20th century. We're getting some warming. Most of the warming is coming at night in the northern latitudes during the winter. So basically, in Alaska, you might see a 35 degree below zero low instead of a 40 degrees below zero low. That's not too alarming.
Thank you for your discussion. My father was a meteorologist, and his one saying was that man's impact on Mother Nature or climate is equivalent to the flatulence of a flea affecting your life. It doesn't exist. It's promoted for government control of us. That being said, my question has to do with wind farms. And wind farms suck energy out of those wind patterns. Are there any studies being done as to potential climate changes downwind of these wind farms? Thank you.
So thank you for the question. I'll take the prerogative of speaking first, and by all means, if either Craig or John want to as well. Wind turbines, of course, this is real interesting. Just a quick tangent. 2 scientists from Harvard University, peer-reviewed study, they believe in a climate crisis. They wanted to figure out how many wind turbines we would need to replace conventional energy with wind turbines. What they found is that we would literally have to carpet 1/3 of the American landmass with turbines to replace our current electricity use. And if we electrify transportation, which is what the environmental left wants, we would now have to cover 1/2 of the American landscape with turbines. You talk about an anti-green program. You talk about environmental destruction. That it would be the worst environmental catastrophe that could ever be unleashed on this country. Now, as far as the specifics of your question, there have been studies, 2 things that have been noted in studies regarding wind turbines and their impact on the local climate. First of all is that when you have the wind turbines, yes, indeed, there's been a drying out of the soil in the area where wind turbines are. If you're concerned about climate change causing droughts or drying out of soil, wind turbines are not your answer. Also, I believe this was also Harvard scientists, different scientists, I believe, that conducted a study on what the impact, the temperature impact of wind turbines would be. And what they found is that in terms of the manufacturing process of the wind turbines, the fact that you're slowing down the winds, drying out the soil, et cetera, that carpeting America with wind turbines, going to a full wind power economy, would actually increase temperatures at least through the year 2100. If you are scared of warming temperatures, wind turbines are not your answer.
I wouldn't change much of that answer, but to say they can be a very small part of the answer. But I largely agree with what James said, that it's an overblown solution that the left is pushing.
Who determined what is the ideal temperature and the ideal CO2 level for the world? What's the name of the narcissist that came up with that? And the second part of my question would be, is not water vapor a more influential factor in the climate, in the atmosphere, water vapor, and are we going to control the amount of evaporation from the oceans and the lakes and the streams?
As for who it is exactly, it's kind of the UN IPCC. We actually have a funny Morano Minute. That's a little thing we put up about Mark Morano each week, where they kind of admit that they pulled it out of thin air, what is the right temperature, and that even this 1.5 degrees or 2 degrees that we're supposed to stay below is just something that they came up with because it sounded good and something to rally the public around. So we have them on record kind of just admitting that, for the most part, that these are statistics they're kind of grabbing at. There is a bias toward our current climate, as though our current climate is the ideal of all time, when we know from temperature record data that it was likely warmer during the medieval warm period of 1,000 years ago, and likely warmer during the Roman period. And what is the optimal temperature? They used to say the climate optimum was back during the time of the dinosaurs, when they thought it was much higher levels of CO2 were at right around 400 parts per million. It was up probably over 1,000 parts per million naturally back then, and there was no climate apocalypse. They used to call it the best time period in Earth's history, but that's, of course, changed right now. So a lot of this is kind of science fiction, I think, where they're coming up with these numbers. Little interesting category. We're hearing about these UFOs and everything that are out there right now. Little known fact, and I just throw this out there. Did you know, remember the Roswell incident back a long time ago? Did you know 9 months after that incident, in 1948, Al Gore was born? I just throw that out there.
We're down to 9 minutes, so just so our speakers know, and go ahead, next question, please.
All right, I'll try to make it quick. Three points in a question. The first point is, right now the regulatory time for a nuclear power plant is over 20 years, and that's the reason why you haven't seen nuclear power plants generated in quite a long time. Second, one of the points that I wanted to bring up that hasn't been brought up by your answer about having a solution to a problem. Yeah. If you go back to the 60s when the first climate change models were being developed under sustainable economic models, there have been over 20 models that have all failed. And so there hasn't been a single one that's actually gotten close to an answer. And so as when AOC says 10 years, well, again, if you go back to Al Gore, we should have been dead another, I guess that was about 10 years ago that we should have died from Al Gore's predictions, just to give you an idea. And the third one, which actually goes into the question, is one point that isn't brought up by the data that y'all brought up about heat is most of the temperatures are done at airports, and an airport gets built, it's 20 miles away from the city, and then the city develops towards that airport, and what you see is a localized increase in temperature over time because of that localized heating that occurs. And so when the NOAA will take the raw data, most of these analyses will take the raw data, very few actually go and normalize the data for purposes of that, and that needs to be done and needs to be addressed. I haven't seen that done well. So here's the question that it comes up with, and it's a two-part question. I love what you said about wind in terms of wind turbines. Have you looked at that from a perspective of solar panels? How many solar panels it would take and the land mass it would take in terms of solar panels? That's the first question. And then going along those same lines, if you have a solar panel on every roof in a neighborhood, let's say you have a 20-house HOA, and 19 of those houses put a solar panel on their roof. What happens to that 20th house where the localized temperature in that HOA goes up by 2-3% or 2 or 3 degrees because of the residual heat coming off the solar panels? Does that 20th house have a lawsuit? Or does that 20th house have a reaction to be able to say, you've damaged my home because it's now 3 degrees warmer in my neighborhood than it was without? So I'd love to hear your comments, and I'll step down now and stop ranting, okay?
Okay, I'll just make it quick because we're getting short on time. In response to that, yes, the solar panels, they require much, much, much more land than conventional energy. Not as bad as wind power, I'll give them that, but it's still much, much more than wind and solar power. So if you are a conservationist, if you love the Badlands of South Dakota, if you love the Great Open Plains, I drove through the Sandhills in Nebraska to get here, I love those too. I don't want to see solar panels or wind turbines destroying that. Regarding solar panels on roofs, boy, you also have a lot of problems with structural damage to roofs, to the weight on that. There are many insurers that won't insure your home if you have the solar panels on your roof. Something to be worried about.
Go for it.
It's very fun to be in a group of people that don't throw rocks at skeptics, because I'm a skeptic. I think, James knows me a little bit, so I'm going to just be fairly pointed in my question and not belabor the science. I think what we learned today was that science is complicated. Everybody walks away saying, how do all those facts add up to something? Can I extrapolate the facts to a conclusion that CO2 is a problem or not? And I'm not going to try to answer that question. I'm not going to ask that question. But I think what is important, what I see, and what James and I were talking about just briefly at lunch, is the fact that we have several organizations, 3 organizations up there, and I have been promoting the idea of cooperative efforts to attack different audiences as opposed to one size fits all from a silo A and a silo B and a silo C. So I think that what we're seeing is, do facts matter? I think most people you'd ask outside this room, they would say facts. What facts are we talking about? And as John is taking a particular point of view, as we saw the other gentleman take earlier in the session. And I have to ask that, there is an overlap of objectives and so on, and I'm going to get to a question here. But I think that what's kind of important is the industry of think tanks prepared to go out and take on different audiences with national campaigns to go explain the science, because it isn't being explained. We're talking to each other. I can talk to James for hours, and he and I have been on a panel program in San Francisco. We can talk for hours to each other, but are we prepared to talk to some of the people here about what is the science of CO2. Can you really warm the atmosphere by 30 to 30%? Can you, John, warm the atmosphere by 30% with 0.04% increase in the atmosphere? Can you do that? And the answer is no. So I think the facts do matter, but they have to be linked and massaged and tailored to different audiences. My question, I'm sorry for the longevity. My question is this: has there been or will there be any attempts to cut across nonprofit think tanks to form message appropriate to different audiences?
I mean, that's a great question. I think the answer is not enough. I mean, I think there's more work that needs to be done among the think tank community to understand what is the nature of the risk and what are we willing to do about it, and then how do we message that. And I would just say, just a quick response to the gentleman's question about what is the optimal temperature. Fabulous question. I would say the answer is whatever we can adapt to is really, and so I would say there's a 90% chance that this is all going to be done through adaptation. We'll look back on this in 20 years and think, well, we adapted to whatever changes come about. And there could be, but there is a small risk that there's something going to be worse than that, which is why, again, the answer is not the Green New Deal. It's an economic freedom agenda.
And I'd say some of what you're talking about is actually occurring. John and I and James and Mark and Benji have been talking as a result of the conferences like this about future activities we could maybe talk about. There is a disagreement, obviously, on the severity of climate change. They would tend to take it more seriously than I guess James and I do. That said, if they could perhaps, and I think there's been some interest in there, deflate some of the extremist claims of OAC and Al Gore and others and mention that they're out to lunch, and before they move on to the solutions, that would help us. And as James even put out here, we're not necessarily opposed to their solutions so long as it limits government and doesn't increase costs of energy. So I think there is room for this sort of coming together on certain issues to a degree. So am I right there, John?
You're absolutely right.
There you go.
My question is real quick. Given AOC's Green New Deal, isn't it pretty obvious at this time that this is all political to lead us towards socialism and away from capitalism?
Without a doubt, absolutely. Look what the Green New Deal wants to do. They want, the first step to, quote, solve the climate crisis is to enact Medicare for all, universal basic income, free college. So that's what their proposal says. And so again, that creates a tremendous opportunity to, I think, win back younger people who've been seduced and deceived by what AOC is offering.
All right. So my main concern is not really looking at the temperature, is it this high or this low, but stuff like acid rain, smog, things that we can clearly see in front of us. They're more localized issues, right? So, to say that there isn't a problem, there is a problem with industry sometimes, and to say that there isn't is an issue. I'm not anti-industry by any means, and I'm not saying I'm anti-nuclear either. But there is a problem with humans. We've seen terrorists attack stuff before. Where are we storing this nuclear waste, for example? And if we have a nuclear plant in a highly density area for population, go do a dirty bomb attack on it. Terrorists will stop at anything. I mean, even the Japanese had kamikaze fighters. So this isn't something that is unknown to history before, and there are certain risks with stuff. And I do appreciate the idea of a free market getting to solutions. And technology gets better over time. So yes, these old wind turbines that kill birds, that are fiberglass, you can't recycle them, yeah, they're a huge problem, right? And the government just wants to keep funneling money into them and ignoring the upstarts and newer technology that come out. And I think, free market, let it, whatever works, works. Who can offer the lowest price point, over a long period of time, that's who should win.
Thank you so much for your comments, and I'm very appreciative of your concern for the environment. It's one of the reasons why I do not place very much of a priority on reducing carbon dioxide emissions. I would rather have us address real environmental issues. I'd rather have us conserve as much land as possible. Specifically regarding nuclear power and spent nuclear fuel and storage and all that, you bring up a fantastic point, because Congress back in the 1980s approved that the Yucca Mountain facility in Nevada, away from population, natural structure that would solidify it, keep it entombed for thousands of years, plus human enhancements to do so. And then for political reasons, people trying to make some political hay off it, it was rejected. So now it's being stored at the local facilities. And I think that's an opportunity that was missed, and hopefully we'll have some common sense environmental policy rather than politics. Thank you so much. That's a great question and observation. I think we are down to our last question, and so for the gentleman behind you, please, I'm happy to talk with you afterwards, or we will be. Go ahead.
Okay, fortunately, it's a quick one. Loving this discussion and everything, and really inspired by it. Follow this topic quite a bit. Just want to know if any of you guys can pull the right strings to maybe get someone like Joe Nova here next year. She would be awesome.
I agree with that. And by the way, we are going to hopefully have Joe Nova at the Heartland Institute's 14th Annual International Conference on Climate Change, which will be October 15th through 17th of this year at Caesars Palace in Las Vegas, Nevada. You can find more information and buy tickets. They're going fast, but there's still some available at heartland.org.
Let's give our speakers a round of applause.
Thank you. I lost my bag, my computer bag. Hopefully they'll have. Hopefully it'll stop.
They just were texting me, and that's why I was.